The morning sun streamed through the blinds as Lynn finished her coffee. Another day, another stack of financial reports to review. As a forensic accountant at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, she was used to seeing numbers that didn't add up. But this time felt different. 3 weeks ago, while reviewing quarterly expense reports, Lynn had noticed something odd. A research project code kept appearing with massive budget allocations, yet it didn't match any official studies in the company database. When she casually asked her supervisor about it, his face had turned pale before he quickly changed the subject. That reaction only fueled her curiosity. Now, as she sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of paper, Lynn carefully cross-referenced invoices with shipping manifests. The patterns were becoming clear: money flowing to shell companies, testing equipment being sent to unmarked facilities, and safety reports with impossibly perfect results. "Someone's watching again," Lynn whispered to herself, feeling eyes on her back. She casually stretched, using the motion to glance behind her. The security camera in the corner had turned slightly, now pointed directly at her workstation. This was the third time this week. At lunchtime, Lynn walked to the park across the street, finding a bench far from others. She pulled out her phone and added encrypted notes to a file she'd been building. The evidence was pointing to something alarming: Meridian's new miracle drug, praised for treating rare blood disorders without side effects, wasn't as safe as they claimed. From what she could piece together, patients in early trials had experienced severe liver damage, but those results had mysteriously disappeared from official records. Back at her apartment that evening, Lynn was greeted by enthusiastic barking. Rusty, her copper-colored German shepherd, bounded toward her, tail wagging wildly. He had been a washout from police dog training, too gentle-natured for the work, they'd said. Their loss was her gain. "Hey, buddy," she said, kneeling to receive his affectionate greeting. "At least someone's happy to see me." Lynn dropped her bag and kicked off her shoes. She filled Rusty's bowl before grabbing leftovers from the fridge for herself. As they ate, Lynn couldn't stop thinking about what she'd discovered. People were taking this drug believing it was safe. Doctors were prescribing it based on falsified data. How many might get sick? How many might die? After dinner, Lynn sat on her living room floor, papers spread around her in organized chaos. Rusty lay beside her, his warm presence comforting as she worked deep into the night. She'd been gathering evidence for almost 2 months now, careful, methodical, making copies and storing them in multiple locations. The picture it painted was damning. Meridian had spent millions bribing officials to fast-track approval, covering up negative test results and silencing questions. The company stood to make billions from this drug, and they weren't going to let safety concerns get in their way. "What do you think, Rusty? Am I crazy for doing this?" she asked, scratching behind his ears. The dog leaned into her touch, dark eyes full of unquestioning loyalty. Lynn had always followed rules. She'd built her career on precision and accuracy, never made waves. But this was different. This was wrong on a level she couldn't ignore. Her finger hovered over the send button on an encrypted email she'd prepared. Attached was a preliminary report with enough evidence to trigger an official investigation. The recipient, the Federal Drug Safety Commission's anonymous whistleblower portal. Rusty sensed her hesitation and placed his paw on her knee, as if encouraging her. Lynn smiled at him, took a deep breath, and pressed send. "No going back now," she whispered, closing her laptop. She didn't sleep much that night. Every car that passed on the street below made her tense. Was she being paranoid, or had that same blue Satan circled the block 3 times? Lynn pulled the blinds shut and double-checked her door locks before finally crawling into bed. Rusty hopped up beside her, his weight a reassuring presence as she drifted into uneasy sleep. Lynn had no way of knowing then that she'd just pulled the first thread in a dangerous unraveling, or that the simple act of sending that email had set powerful forces in motion, forces that would stop at nothing to protect their profits. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. A week passed since Lynn had sent the whistleblower report. The knot in her stomach tightened with each passing day. She tried to maintain her normal routine, but it was getting harder to act normal when nothing felt normal anymore. The first odd thing happened on Tuesday. Lynn pulled into the company parking lot and noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked near the entrance. As she walked by, she caught a glimpse of someone inside, quickly turning away when she glanced over. That same vehicle was there when she left work, and again the next morning. You're getting paranoid, she told herself, but the prickling feeling at the back of her neck wouldn't go away. At her desk, Lynn kept her head down, pretending to work on quarterly reports while secretly watching who came and went from the executive floor. The company president had called an emergency board meeting that morning. Through the glass walls of the conference room, she could see red faces and wild gestures. Someone had slammed their fist on the table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. Around lunchtime, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check your email. Heart racing, Lynn opened her personal email to find a message from the Federal Drug Safety Commission acknowledging receipt of her report. They were launching a preliminary investigation. It was happening. It was really happening. That afternoon, Lynn's department head stopped by her cubicle. "The security chief wants to see you," he said, not meeting her eyes. The security office was on the top floor, next to the executive suite. Lynn had never been there before. Her palms were sweaty as she knocked on the frosted glass door. "Come in," called a deep voice. The security chief, Mr. Voss, sat behind a massive desk. He was a big man with a military-style haircut and a tight smile that never reached his eyes. Former Special Forces, people whispered. The company hired him after some protesters had broken into one of their labs a few years back. "Ah, Lynn. Please have a seat." He gestured to a chair across from him. "Coffee? Water?" "No, thank you," Lynn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Mr. Voss leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I'd like to check in with all our key team members from time to time. You've been putting in a lot of extra hours lately." Lynn shrugged. "End of quarter. Always busy." "Of course." He nodded. "You know, we value loyalty here at Meridian. We're like family. And families protect each other, don't they?" "I suppose they do." He leaned forward suddenly. "You've been accessing files outside your department. Can't you explain why?" Lynn had prepared for this, cross-referencing for the audit. There were some discrepancies in the research allocation codes. "I wanted to make sure my numbers were accurate before flagging anything." A long pause followed as Mr. Voss stared at her. "Always the thorough one, aren't you? That's what your supervisor says. Attention to detail." He stood up and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "It would be a shame if something distracted you from your excellent work here. Outside pressures, personal issues, that sort of thing." The threat was clear despite his casual tone. "I'm very focused on my job," Lynn said quietly. "Good. Keep it that way." He turned back with that empty smile. "By the way, how's that dog of yours? Rusty, isn't it? Beautiful animal. I saw a photo on your desk once." Ice flooded Lynn's veins. How did he know her dog's name? "He's fine," she managed to say. "Take care of him. I hear that neighborhood of yours has had some issues with poisoned meat being left in yards. People trying to deal with coyotes, probably. Nasty business." Lynn drove home in a daze, hands shaking on the steering wheel. They knew. Somehow they knew she was the whistleblower. And that comment about poison wasn't random. When she finally got home, Rusty greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, but Lynn couldn't shake the feeling of dread. She double-checked all her locks and windows. As she was pulling the curtains closed, she spotted a dark car parked across the street. That night, Lynn slept with Rusty on her bed and her cell phone clutched in her hand. Before turning out the light, she noticed something else that sent chills down her spine. The desk drawer where she kept her backup files was slightly open, not how she'd left it. Someone had been in her house. This was no longer about doing the right thing. This was about survival. The next morning, Lynn called in sick to work. She couldn't face that building, not after yesterday's thinly veiled threats. She spent the day checking and rechecking her evidence, moving files to new secure locations, and watching the street through a crack in her blinds. The same dark car appeared twice, driving slowly past her house. By afternoon, Lynn had made up her mind. She needed to get Rusty somewhere safe until this blew over. She called her cousin who lived 2 hours away, the only relative she fully trusted. "I need a favor," Lynn said. "Can I bring Rusty to stay with you for a week or two?" "Of course," her cousin replied. "Everything okay?" "Just some stuff going on at work. I might need to travel, and I don't want to board him." Lynn hung up and started packing Rusty's food, toys, and bed. She'd drive him to her cousin's place tomorrow morning. One night, she thought, just keep him safe for one more night. That evening, Lynn took Rusty for his usual walk, but stayed closer to home than normal. The neighborhood felt different somehow, quieter watching. When a car turned onto her street, she quickly tugged Rusty behind a hedge until it passed. Back home, Lynn double-checked all the windows and doors before settling in for a restless night. She kept Rusty close, his warm body pressed against hers, a small comfort in the growing storm. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Lynn fed Rusty his breakfast while she packed the last of his things into the car. "We'll hit the road in 10 minutes, buddy," she told him, scratching behind his ears. "Just let me grab my bag." Lynn went to her bedroom to get her overnight bag. She was only planning to drop Rusty off and come right back, but something told her to pack a change of clothes just in case. As she zipped up the bag, she heard Rusty bark once from the backyard, his "someone's here" bark. Lynn froze. She'd let him out for a quick bathroom break before the drive. Now the house was silent. "Rusty," she called, moving toward the back door. No response, no clicking of nails on hardwood, no whine of greeting. Something was wrong. Lynn rushed through the kitchen and flung open the back door. "Rusty, come here, boy." Her eyes scanned the small fenced yard, landing on a splash of copper-colored fur near the back gate. Rusty lay on his side, unusually still. "No, no, no," Lynn whispered, running to him. She fell to her knees beside him, hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch and confirm what she already knew. His eyes were open but vacant, his body already cooling in the morning sun. Beside him was a half-eaten piece of meat. Lynn's vision blurred with tears as she gently stroked his fur. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I'm so sorry." Her voice broke, the words dissolving into sobs that shook her entire body. She didn't know how long she knelt there, cradling Rusty's head in her lap, tears falling onto his still form. The grief was physical, a crushing weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. When she finally looked up, Lynn noticed the back gate was slightly ajar. Someone had been in her yard. Someone had deliberately killed her dog, her friend, her protector, her family. Grief began to crystallize into something harder, colder. Lynn had never considered herself a fighter. She was an accountant, someone who lived in the world of numbers and regulations. But as she sat there with Rusty's body growing cold in her arms, something shifted inside her. They thought they'd frightened her. They thought killing her dog would silence her. They didn't know about her past. Before becoming an accountant, Lynn had spent 6 years in military intelligence. 2 tours overseas in combat zones, training in surveillance, counter-surveillance, and hand-to-hand combat. Skills she'd packed away when she returned to civilian life, believing, hoping, she'd never need them again. With trembling hands, Lynn pulled out her phone and called a veterinarian, asking if they could perform tests to confirm what she already knew, that Rusty had been poisoned. Then she called her cousin. "Change of plans," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her face. "I won't be bringing Rusty, but I need to ask you something else. Do you still have that storage locker with my old military gear?" "Yeah, why?" "I'm going to need it. All of it." Lynn hung up and looked once more at Rusty. She gently laid his head down and stood, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "They're going to pay for this," she whispered. "I promise you that." Inside, Lynn went straight to her closet and pushed aside hanging clothes to reveal a small safe. She entered the combination and pulled out a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside was her military ID, several passports, and a sealed envelope with contact information for former colleagues, people with specialized skills, people who operated in shadows, people who owed her favors. Lynn had tried to leave that life behind, but they'd crossed a line. They'd taken something irreplaceable from her. Now they would learn exactly who they were dealing with. After burying Rusty in the far corner of her backyard, beneath the oak tree where he loved to lie in the shade, Lynn took a long shower. She let the hot water wash away her tears, but not her resolve. By the time she stepped out, her mind was clear, focused in a way it hadn't been in years. She called work and requested an immediate family leave, citing a personal emergency. Her supervisor seemed relieved not to have to deal with her. That bought her time. Lynn drove 3 hours to meet her cousin at the storage facility. The padlock was rusty, but the key still worked. Inside sat 4 large military trunks, untouched for nearly 5 years. "You sure about this?" her cousin asked, watching as Lynn ran her hand over the dusty lid of the nearest trunk. "They killed Rusty," Lynn said simply. Her cousin nodded, understanding that nothing else needed to be said. "What do you need from me?" "A place to stay for a few days, somewhere they can't connect to me." "My fishing cabin. No one knows about it except family." Lynn spent the rest of the day hauling her trunks to the remote cabin, nestled in woods near a small lake. By nightfall, the cabin's main room looked like a military command center. Maps, equipment, and supplies covered every surface. From one trunk, she pulled out her old tactical gear, clothing, boots, and utility vests. From another came surveillance equipment, tiny cameras, listening devices, and signal jammers. The third trunk held communication devices and weapons, not guns, but non-lethal options like stun batons and pepper spray. The fourth trunk was the most valuable. It contained her old field notebooks and a laptop loaded with specialized software, the kind not available to civilians. Lynn plugged in the laptop, surprised when it powered up without issue. The battery backup had kept the system in hibernation all these years. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory taking over as she entered a series of passwords. The screen filled with encrypted files, training manuals, contact information, operational procedures. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she still knew by heart. "Tech support," answered a gruff voice. "This is Sparrow," Lynn said, using her old call sign. "Authentication code Bravo 9 Echo 37. A pause. "Sparrow? Been a while. Thought you flew the coop for good. Need to come in from the cold. Calling in that favor." Another pause. "What do you need?" "Digital forensics. Background on a pharmaceutical company called Meridian. And their security chief, a man named Voss. Give me 12 hours. Lynn made 2 more calls that night. The first to a woman who specialized in counter-surveillance, the second to a former military lawyer who'd helped her navigate a particularly tricky extraction in her past life. By morning, Lynn had transformed. Hair pulled back in a tight bun, no makeup, utility pants with multiple pockets, fitted black t-shirt, combat boots laced tight. Her posture had changed too, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes constantly scanning her surroundings. The accountant was gone. The operative had returned. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from tech support. The information was more valuable than she hoped. Mr. Voss, it turned out, had a history as a private military contractor with several allegations of excessive force that had been quietly settled. More importantly, tech support had identified the entire Meridian security team, 6 men, all with similar backgrounds. Former military or law enforcement who'd left under questionable circumstances. Lynn pulled out a notebook and began sketching the layout of her house and the surrounding neighborhood. She marked entry points, blind spots, potential surveillance positions. Then she made a list of equipment she would need. By afternoon, she was in a hardware store 2 towns over, buying motion sensors, floodlights, and tools. She paid cash and wore a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. That evening, Lynn stood in the middle of the fishing cabin, surrounded by her planning materials. On one wall hung a detailed timeline of Meridian's drug development and approval process, with key players identified. On another, photos of the security team members with notes about their patterns and weaknesses. Her former team leader had always said the same thing before every mission: preparation wins battles before they're fought. Lynn checked her watch, nearly midnight. Time to move to Phase 2. She packed a small bag with surveillance equipment and changed into dark clothing. Tonight, she would turn the tables. Instead of being watched, she would become the watcher. She would learn their patterns, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. "This is for you, Rusty," she whispered as she slipped out into the darkness, a shadow moving among shadows, unnoticed by the men who thought they'd broken her. They had no idea what was coming. For 3 nights, Lynn watched her own house from a neighbor's shed. The elderly couple who owned it were away visiting their daughter, and Lynn had always collected their mail when they traveled. They'd given her a key years ago, never imagining she'd use it to conduct surveillance. From this hidden spot, Lynn documented every vehicle that slowed near her property. She photographed the men who took turns watching her house, noting their patterns and routines. They worked in pairs, switching every 6 hours. Always the same 4 men. Amateurs, Lynn whispered to herself as she watched them through high-powered binoculars. They made basic mistakes, smoking in the car, ordering food delivery, checking their phones too often. Their sloppy habits gave her exactly what she needed. On the 4th night, Lynn made her move. She'd identified the weakest team, 2 men she'd nicknamed Smoker and Phone Guy, based on their habits. They'd always parked in the same spot, 3 houses down with a clear view of her front door. Tonight, they'd be watching an empty house, unaware their target was watching them. Lynn crept through backyards until she was positioned behind their sedan. Dressed entirely in black, she blended with the shadows. She'd done this hundreds of times in her military days, but the familiar rush of adrenaline still surprised her. When Smoker stepped out for his 10 p.m. cigarette, Lynn was ready. She kept low, using parked cars as cover until she was close enough to hear him talking on his phone. "Nothing again tonight," he grumbled. "This is a waste of time. She's probably staying with family." Lynn recorded the conversation on a small device. Then, while he was distracted, she placed a tiny tracking device under the rear bumper of their car. Back at the cabin, Lynn plugged the tracking data into her laptop. Now she could monitor their movements in real time. Her intelligence gathering was nearly complete. The next morning, Lynn drove to a coffee shop 2 towns over. Using a burner phone, she called the direct line she found for Mr. Voss. "Security," he answered. "You should train your men better," Lynn said, disguising her voice slightly. "They smoke too much, makes them easy to spot." A pause. "Who is this?" Lynn continued as if he hadn't spoken. "The black sedan. Pennsylvania plates ending in 847. Currently parked outside my empty house. Such a waste of company resources." She heard his sharp intake of breath. "Look, we can talk about this." "I'm not interested in talking. I'm interested in you calling off your dogs. You made a mistake killing my pet. Don't make another one." Lynn hung up before he could respond. She didn't expect this to stop them, but it would shake their confidence. Let them know she wasn't afraid. Let them wonder what else she knew. By afternoon, the tracking data showed the sedan racing back to Meridian headquarters. Lynn smiled. Message received. Her next step was more risky. Lynn needed to get into Meridian's secure system to retrieve additional evidence. Her whistleblower report had focused only on the falsified drug safety data, but she suspected there was more. Evidence of bribes, cover-ups, perhaps even previous whistleblowers who'd been silenced. For this, she needed help. Lynn contacted her tech specialist friend again. "I need to plant something in their system," she explained. "That's crossing a line," came the reply. "You're talking about illegal access." "They crossed the line first," Lynn said quietly. "They came into my home. They killed my dog." A long pause. "What exactly do you need?" Lynn outlined her plan. She would mail a small package to someone in the accounting department, a promotional USB drive supposedly from their tax software provider. When plugged in, it would create a backdoor into the system. "Oldest trick in the book," her friend warned. "Nobody falls for that anymore." "You don't know Meridian's accounting department," Lynn replied. "Half of them still write their passwords on sticky notes." 2 days later, Lynn sat at her laptop, watching as the backdoor program activated. Someone had taken the bait. Files began downloading: internal memos, emails, security footage, each one more damning than the last. What caught her attention was a folder labeled Personnel Issues. Inside were files on 3 former employees who had raised concerns about the drug. All 3 had resigned suddenly. One had moved abroad. Another had changed careers entirely. The third had died in what was ruled an accident. Lynn's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about covering up side effects. People who spoke up disappeared or died. As she was processing this information, an alert flashed on her screen. The tracking device showed 2 vehicles leaving Meridian headquarters, both heading toward her cabin. They'd found her. Somehow, they'd traced the digital connection. Lynn shut down her laptop and quickly packed her essential gear. She prepared for this possibility. It was time for Phase 3. Instead of running, she would lead them exactly where she wanted them to go. Lynn moved quickly, gathering only what she absolutely needed. The cabin would be compromised soon. She loaded her gear into the trunk of her car, leaving behind enough personal items to make it look like she'd fled in a hurry. Before leaving, she activated 3 small cameras hidden around the property. If they came, she would know exactly who and how many. Lynn drove to a small motel 30 miles away, paid cash for a room, and set up her laptop. The tracking data showed the 2 vehicles had reached the cabin. She switched to the camera feeds and watched 6 men, including Mr. Voss, searching the premises. "Looking for me?" she whispered, feeling a grim satisfaction as they tore through her belongings. While they wasted time at the cabin, Lynn was executing the most important part of her plan. She opened an encrypted email program and attached hundreds of files, all the evidence she'd gathered about Meridian's dangerous drug, the falsified safety reports, and the suspicious fates of previous whistleblowers. She had prepared 3 separate packages of information with different delivery methods. The first went to the Federal Drug Safety Commission through their secure whistleblower portal. The second to a journalist she'd researched thoroughly, someone with a history of exposing corporate wrongdoing. The third to her military lawyer friend, with instructions to release everything publicly if anything happened to her. Lynn hit send on all 3 messages within minutes of each other. Then she picked up her burner phone and called a number she'd memorized, the direct line to Meridian's CDO. A secretary answered, but Lynn cut her off. "Tell him it's about Voss and the whistleblower. He'll take the call." After a moment of silence, a man's voice came on the line. "Who is this?" "Someone who just sent your company's dirty laundry to federal investigators and the press," Lynn said calmly. "You have a drug on the market that causes liver failure. You've known about it for months. You falsified safety reports. And when people tried to speak up, they disappeared." "These are serious accusations," the CEO said, his voice tight. "If you've made false claims." "Everything is documented. Emails between your research team discussing the liver damage. Financial records showing bribes to testing facilities. Security footage of your research director shredding the original reports." Lynn paused. "And now I have evidence that your security team has been stalking me, broke into my home, and killed my dog." The line went silent for so long that Lynn thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower now. "What do you want?" "I want you to call off your dogs. Immediately." "And then what?" "The damage is done if you've already sent this information out." "Then I suggest you start doing damage control," Lynn said, "beginning with a voluntary recall of the drug before more people get hurt, followed by full cooperation with investigators. That would bankrupt us." "Should have thought of that before putting a dangerous drug on the market," Lynn replied. "You have 30 minutes to call off Voss and his team. After that, I release the names and personal information of everyone involved in the cover-up, including yours." Lynn ended the call and checked her camera feeds again. The men were still searching the cabin, becoming increasingly frustrated as they found nothing useful. Her phone rang, an unlisted number. She answered but said nothing. "We need to talk," said the CEO, "not over the phone." "I'm not meeting you." "Then this won't stop. I can't control what happens next." Lynn had expected this. "Check your email. I just sent you a video file." She watched on her laptop as Voss received a call. His face darkened as he listened. Then he gestured to his men to stop searching. Meanwhile, the CEO would be watching the video she'd sent, footage from her hidden cameras showing Voss and his team illegally searching the cabin, along with a compilation of them surveilling her house, all neatly packaged with timestamps and GPS coordinates. Lynn's phone rang again. "You've made your point," the CEO said. "I've called them off. All of them, including the 2 men watching my house right now." A pause. "They'll be gone within the hour." "Good. Now about that recall. We need time. The board will have tow." "You don't have time," Lynn interrupted. "People are taking your drug today, right now, and you know it's hurting them." The tracking data on her laptop showed Voss and his team leaving the cabin area. They were heading back toward the city. It was working. Then her second phone buzzed with a news alert. The journalist she'd contacted had wasted no time. The headline read, "Meridian Pharmaceuticals under investigation. Whistleblower alleges dangerous drug cover-up." It was happening faster than she'd expected. The story was breaking. There would be no putting this genie back in the bottle. Lynn's main phone rang again, the Federal Drug Safety Commission. They wanted to arrange a formal interview. Things were moving quickly now. As she spoke with the investigator, Lynn kept one eye on her laptop screen, watching the tracker dots that represented Voss and his team, all heading away from her, for now. But Lynn knew better than to let her guard down. This wasn't over. The company was facing ruin. Executives were facing potential criminal charges. People like Voss didn't just walk away when so much was at stake. The corporate battleground had shifted in her favor, but the war wasn't won. Not yet. 2 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Lynn moved between different motels, never staying more than one night in the same place. The story had exploded across news outlets. Meridian's stock was in freefall. The company had announced a voluntary review of their drug, not quite the recall Lynn had demanded, but a start. Lynn checked the tracking devices obsessively. Voss and his team had returned to Meridian headquarters and stayed there, locked in what must have been crisis meetings. On the third morning, Lynn was contacted by the Federal Drug Safety Commission. They wanted her to come in and give a formal statement. They promised protection. "We can send agents to escort you," the investigator told her. "No need," Lynn replied. "I'll come on my own terms." She arranged to meet them the following day. That night, she returned to her house for the first time in over a week. She needed to retrieve the original files hidden in her home office, the physical copies that would back up her digital evidence. Lynn approached cautiously, doing 3 slow drive-bys to check for surveillance. The street looked clear, but she didn't trust appearances. She parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, cutting through backyards until she reached her property. The house was dark and quiet. Using a small flashlight, Lynn entered through the back door and made her way to her office. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she crossed to the bookshelf and removed 3 specific books. Behind them was a small wall safe. Just as she began entering the combination, Lynn froze. A car had pulled up outside, its headlights sweeping across the front of the house before going dark. She quickly turned off her flashlight and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the blinds. A black SUV sat at the curb. The front doors opened, and 2 men stepped out. Even in the darkness, she recognized Voss. He spoke quietly to the other man, then pointed toward the back of the house. Lynn's mind raced. The tracker had shown them at headquarters. They must have left their phones behind to throw her off. This wasn't a random check. They knew she was here. Lynn quietly closed her office door and wedged a chair under the knob. It wouldn't hold them for long, but she needed just enough time to get what she came for. Her fingers flew over the safe's dial, and the door swung open. She grabbed the files and a small recording device, then looked around for an exit. The office window was her only option. Lynn could hear footsteps on the back porch now, then the soft click of someone picking the lock. She slid the window open and slipped out just as she heard the back door swing open. Lynn moved silently along the side of the house, staying in the shadows. She needed to reach her car, but Voss and his man were between her and the street. Her military training took over. Instead of running away, she moved toward the front of the house, keeping low. Voss had left the driver's side door of the SUV open. The keys were still in the ignition. Lynn made a split-second decision. She darted forward, slipped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Voss and his partner came running at the sound, but they were too late. Lynn floored the accelerator, the SUV's tires screeching as she pulled away. In the rearview mirror, she could see Voss shouting into a phone. They would try to follow, but she had their vehicle. The advantage was hers. Lynn drove straight to the federal building downtown. She parked the SUV right in front of the main entrance and walked inside, files in hand. At the security desk, she asked for the lead investigator by name. "Tell him the Meridian whistleblower is here," she said, "and tell him I brought company vehicles with me." Within minutes, Lynn was in a secure conference room, explaining everything to a team of federal agents. She handed over her files, the recording device, and the keys to the SUV. "You might want to check that vehicle," she told them. "I have reason to believe it contains surveillance equipment used in illegal activities." By morning, arrest warrants had been issued for Voss and several Meridian executives. The drug was officially recalled. Lynn watched the news from a hotel room provided by the federal authorities. She felt hollow rather than triumphant. Justice was being served, but it wouldn't bring Rusty back. 3 months later, Lynn stood in the sunshine of a local animal shelter. The legal battles were ongoing, but her part was largely done. A testimony had been recorded, the evidence catalogued. Meridian was facing massive lawsuits and criminal charges. "This one's been here a while," the shelter worker said, opening a kennel door. "Nobody wants her because she's got some health issues. Nothing serious, just needs extra care." A small, copper-colored dog limped forward, one leg clearly damaged from an old injury. Despite this, her tail wagged hopefully as she looked up at Lynn. "What's her story?" Lynn asked. "Found tied to a fence. Someone just left her there. She doesn't trust easily." Lynn knelt down, letting the dog approach at her own pace. "I've got time," she said softly, "and I know something about learning to trust again." The dog sniffed Lynn's outstretched hand, then gently licked her fingers. "I think we understand each other," Lynn whispered. "What do you say we go home?"